So welcome everyone to this webinar. This is the second in a series that we've done, asking sort of where are we right now, what's going on, and the focus of today's webinar is on God and neighbor. So continuing with our theme of where are we now, we're looking to this conversation to wonder about where is God at work through our neighbors in these COVID-19 days. What are we noticing that is different in our neighborhoods due to COVID-19, and where and how are we discerning God at work in what is happening around us? How might we as congregational leaders respond? So today is this Missional Commons webinar is being hosted by the Missional Network and Forge Canada, and the Missional Network is sort of represented here virtually by Fiona and myself, and Cam and Karen Wilk are sort of the representatives of Forge Canada. And then we've got, so we'll invite our panelists, Mark Glanville, Karen Reed, and Karen Wilk in just a moment. But just to sort of help you locate who are these people, what are they doing here? That's who we all are. We should have names coming up under us as well, so you should be able to locate who we are as well as we go along. Cam, do you want to begin then by just doing a little bit more of an introduction of who,
for sure,
who our three panelists are?
So Sarah Jane, I mean, one of the things you said is that we're all, we're on lots of these, and in some ways we feel like we're zoomed out, but one of the things that gives me energy around these conversations, so I think back 2 weeks ago, and Alan and Marilyn had this phenomenal conversation around where are we, particularly in relationship to the Road to Emmaus text that we're going to be in again today. And then this one, as you said, gets me excited because Mark and Karen interacted so well on Tuesday, and I'm eager to hear what they're going to say again today, just around the reality of what we're noticing different in our neighborhoods and how we can pay attention to God in the midst of this. I think what draws me to this is it's a uniquely Canadian conversation, even though we have people from other countries that we're thrilled that they're there. But we're asking a lot of questions, doing a lot of listening, rather than trying to pretend we have all the answers, and that's been pretty refreshing. So I'm excited about that. Karen Reed is here with us as a panelist today. She's from Vancouver and has lived here for a number of years and doing some pretty exciting things in the whole Commercial Drive, Grandview, Calvary sort of neighborhood. And we're going to hear from her a little bit later. And Mark Glanville. Mark's also pastored in the very same neighborhood. I think it was kind of unique that we got the two of them together on the same call. It'll be kind of fun to do that. But Mark's recently accepted a position at Regent College, and so we'll be transitioning there in the very near future. And Mark brings lots to the conversation. We're thrilled to have him. And of course, I've known Karen Wilk for 15 plus years now, and Karen just does some wonderful things about the neighborhood. So we're thrilled. She lives in Edmonton and does something there called Neighborhood Life. We're thrilled to have all three of these wonderful leaders with us to listen and converse around what's going on here in the Canadian context in our day. So that's where we're at. So let me give it back to you to introduce Fiona.
Sure. Yeah, so Fiona is going to be participating in the webinar as well. Fiona's part of the TMN team and has worked fairly extensively with congregations and coaching congregations through all kinds of different our process of transformation, and discerning how do you actually join with God in the neighborhood, what does that look like on the ground, and how do congregations work together, and how do clergy and pastors support their congregations in that journey. She's also been she's been integral to developing key resources as well for TMN. So just to give you a little intro into what we're doing today, we're going to do 3 things. And those 3 things are, we're going to listen to God through the scriptures. So we're going to dwell in the word, Lectio Divina practice that we're going to do together in this environment. And we'll spend some time in the Emmaus Road passage together. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to listen to God through stories. And so we'll share a couple stories and do so with an openness and a readiness to listen and receive what God might be saying to us through the stories that are shared today. And then the third thing we're going to do is invite our panelists into a guided conversation around what are we hearing? What are we hearing coming out of the dwelling and the stories? What are some of the practices? What are some of the questions that are coming up for us? What are some of the practices as leaders we can be paying attention to? And what are we learning about God and neighbor in this new and changing context together? So those are the three pieces, the three moves, if you like, that we'll be doing together. On a practical note, this is a webinar, so you folks are going to be engaging through the chat, so we really encourage you to do that. It's actually quite a rich space. We've been really blessed with some of the transcripts that come out of this chat, some really great questions and interactions, and they actually continue to sustain us after the webinar. We go back and we mine them, and sometimes we're in touch with folks and follow up conversations. So it's a really great space, and we look forward to and anticipate the kinds of interactions that will go on there. In order to do that, if you could just pay attention to making sure that your chat is going to everyone, not just the panelists, so that everyone can see and respond and interact with the things that you have to say. So I believe that's it for the logistics and the intros. And I want to invite Fiona, if she would like to lead us through the first move in our webinar together, which is listening to God through the text and dwelling in the Word together.
Great, thanks, Sarah Jane. So there's a number of ways, and we hope that you will participate with us in dwelling in the text. The text itself is the Emmaus Road text, and if you want to read along as we're going through this, you'll see a link that Sarah Jane's just posted in the chat that will take you to the actual text itself that you can follow along. That same link was in the email that you received just with your confirmation for participation. If you want to click on that link, that will also take you to the text. Or you can also just sit and listen as the text is read to you. So how this is going to work is Sarah Jane's going to read the text once. We're going to have some time of silence in between. And then Cam is going to read the text a second time, followed by a short period of silence. And then we'll invite you to share your responses to these questions. I'm just going to share my screen with you so that you can see the questions that we ask you to listen through as the text is being read. So where did your imagination stop? Are there ideas, words, phrases that grasp you? How do you think the Spirit of God might be nudging you? So those are the questions to be listening through as the text is read. And then we really look forward to seeing your comments and reflections in the chat once we've read through this passage a couple of times. So yeah, I'll ask Sarah Jane to start us off, please.
Luke 24:13-35, the walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And they said to him, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" And they replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening up the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered there. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The word of the Lord.
Let's hear the text a second time. Luke chapter 24, 13 to 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all of this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord.
So today, wherever you are and whatever else is happening in your place, in your work, in your play, in your rest, as you listen to this scripture today, where did your imagination stop? What are the words, phrases, ideas that grasp you? And how do you think the Spirit of God might be nudging you? We'll look for your comments and reflections in the chat. Randall says, and they were talking with each other about all these things. And Cam was caught by this time by the question of, what are you talking about? I wonder if, Cam wonders if he talks about things that matter enough. From Yvonne, weren't our hearts burning? That stuck with Yvonne today. From John, at the moment of hearts burning, I seem to sit with that. George says, yes, they were incredulous that Jesus did not know. Jennifer says, I imagined me walking with them, but didn't see me sitting. The phrase we had hoped he was the one, that he was made known in the breaking of the bread, but they were kept from recognizing him. They wouldn't have missed out on the big reveal if they hadn't urged him to stay when he was making to continue on.
Rosemary said that verse 33, their companions struck her. I'm missing children from stores, playgrounds. They're all inside. Children are important participants in church life.
Why did Jesus ask what things? He knows the things very well. But we had hoped, dashed dreams and despondency, moved towards burning hearts. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Are my eyes open?
Jonathan said they would have missed out on the big reveal if they hadn't urged him to stay when he was making to continue on.
Alan wrote something that resonates with me a lot. I'm struck by how easy it is to lose hope and miss so much. It's also in the walking with that our eyes are opened.
Evan says, as a visual processor, I was dreaming of the proximity and felt drawn to lament.
And Beverly was stuck at our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. That struck her.
Bridget says, the women shared they had a vision of angels, seeing, not seeing. When do we not see Jesus in our midst? When do we see? And Fred comments, their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Jesus is a stranger and an unwanted one, given Cleopas' response.
Sarah May had a couple phrases. She said he had been made known to them and he came near and went with them. And also, how slow you are to believe all the prophets have declared. Reminder to me to remember the things he has done and promised to do.
John comments, the idea that simply walking with is really important. Listening to the other first and not speaking first. Laura comments, how slow of heart to believe that stuck with her today.
And Alan was wondering what eyes were kept from means. Not sure it's that God somehow did this. Perhaps their narratives and expectations, even being so close to Jesus, just caused them to miss what was going on, hence the closed eyes.
Lynn says, my daughter, 6 years old, is noticing that, like Mary, thinking Jesus was the gardener, these disciples also don't recognize him, though he's with them.
Mm.
David says, Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. After telling Cam that Knapp Hill, where I live, is 7 miles from Guildford. So why shouldn't I encounter Jesus in an insignificant place?
That's classic. It's wonderful.
Great.
And from Karen, a sense that they were rehearsing their disappointment of what they expected of how it was supposed to have gone. Jonathan says, I figure what I'm to do is keep my expectations open. So we're going to stay with the text. Just keep this text in your minds as we continue through our time together. I know that Mark and Karen Reed and Karen Wilk are also thinking about that, and in terms of reflecting back to us what it is that they've been hearing through this text. And we're also going to be listening to some stories of others just in a second. But before we do that, we'll just move to this simple liturgy to share with you. And just as we, hold on a second, I just have to move things around a tiny bit so that you all can see this. So there's some bold text in this liturgy, and there's some unbolded text. So I invite you to just participate however you feel comfortable from where it is that where you are today. Lord, that we know that you are good. Your steadfast love endures, your faithfulness to all generations. You continue to show us your goodness right here in this place. We see the signs of your life and coming kingdom in the places we live, work, and worship. Lord, we know that you are good. Lord, awaken us
to
to
your presence.
You call us to another way of being in the world, to your way of loving, living, and being with neighbors. Lord,
awaken us to your presence.
In the stories we receive from people in our everyday lives, may we listen with the expectation that you are present. Lord, awaken us
to your presence. Thanks, Fiona. So as Fiona said, we're going to keep that passage and our dwelling in it with us throughout this this time together. So even as we move to stories and as we move to our panelist interactions, that text is going to continue to come with us, and we're going to continue to reflect upon it. So we're going to move to the second part now, which is our stories, and we've invited. We want folks to share a story. We've invited just a couple of folks to do that. What they're noticing that's different in your neighborhood due to COVID-19. So just a small story about what's different in your neighborhood due to COVID-19. And these stories, again, are a way to listen and discern and see what God's up to. And we come to these stories with an openness and a curiosity. We don't need these stories to have big meanings or to unveil huge truths, but we come to these stories in some ways like the scripture, where we expect that God is present and that God and Jesus himself will be revealed in and through those stories as we dwell in them and listen to them. So what I wanted to do just to start was to read, we posed this question or asked this, please share a story of what you're noticing that's different in your neighborhood due to COVID-19. And we shared it on Facebook yesterday, I believe, in our Missional Commons Facebook group. And I just wanted to read a couple brief responses that just give you a taste of some of what other people are noticing before we invite, I think Karen Wilk was going to share our first story with us. So Chris shares, so many people are working in their front yards. One's building a hydroponic garden, we're building a shed, neighbors pull up, roll down their car windows, and they chat. And then Sara responded, I'm seeing and meeting people who live in basement apartments who before now would just go from car to door and never be or have permission to be on front lawns, etc. So now people are hanging out more. Karen shares, creation is singing louder, perhaps because of less traffic noise, perhaps because of less pollution. And neighbors are commenting on noticing that they're noticing nature around them much more. Example, birds singing and chipmunks scurrying. Another never realized that there are so many pussy willows at this time of year in the neighborhood. And you can really tell which lawns face north and south as there's snow in some places, while in others they're sprouting green. And then Merv shared, there are so many more people walking and we're much more attentive to one another, not only giving space for social distancing, but saying hi and greeting one another, whereas people would often ignore one another as if they were just strangers. And now we see one another as fellow sufferers in this crisis. And just some comments before, back and forth there, is I think it's created a strange sense of common identity. The tagline we hear so often is, we're in this together, suggests that the crisis has become sort of unifying in some kind of way. So Cam, do you want to invite our storytellers?
Yeah. So, I mean, these are wonderful stories off the Missional Commons Facebook group, and encourage people to go there. Karen Wilk from Edmonton. You are deeply involved in some neighborhood stuff. So what's your answer to the question? How has COVID-19 changed? What are some things that you're seeing as a result in your neighborhood?
Well, I'll just tell one story. There's many, and that is of a nearby neighbor who, for the last few years in particular, has absolutely been disengaged and disconnected from neighbors. She went through a divorce, and I think that had much to do with it, and now has a new partner, and they have 5 kids, and they're have been extremely busy, with one doing 14 hours of gymnastics a week and a couple of them in hockey and so on. So for the last few years, we barely got a wave out of her. In fact, most of the time she's screaming by so quickly that we don't even get a wave. But I happened to be out walking with our 8-year-old neighbor who likes to take our dog, and we were going right by her place as she was driving up. And instead of going into her garage and shutting the garage door before she even gets out of the car, she actually came out into the driveway and started a conversation. So this to me is kind of a reflection of that, we're on this road for a long time, and people know that, like the disciples, the 2, and an opportunity for me to listen. And so I just asked how she was doing, how the COVID was affecting her family, and she talked a lot about, now we have time to have dinner together. The kids are a little bored, and we engaged with one another. And just as we were, sort of talking about the impact globally, a delivery truck came by, and she pointed at it and said, well, that's one thing for sure that we're learning, that these are the heroes, these are the important people, whereas me and my family have spent most of our time cheering on the professional sports teams and have been big fans there. We want to be fans of those workers now. And I just thought, wow, I wonder how God is working in her and in others to shift our perspectives and to show us some new things about who's important and what it's really all about.
Karen, that was great. Thank you for doing that. Yeah. New perspectives, new things that God's up to. And he speaks through our neighbors just as much as he does in other ways. And so wonderful to hear that. George Werner from Ontario. George has been a pastor, a denominational leader, an international missionary, but just most of all, he's a good friend. So George, welcome. We would love to have you share a little bit what you're seeing in your neighborhood, what you're learning from what God's up to, or what difference COVID has made in the neighborhood where you live. So welcome.
Thanks. Thanks for this opportunity, Cam and friends. It's a great opportunity. We live in a townhouse complex here in Kitchener-Waterloo. It's 100 units in a very small piece of property. And we've noticed that our people, our neighbors are out on the street more than ever before. And during the daytime, it's always the young families with children. Children aren't in school, obviously. But in the evening, it's the empty nesters like us. In our neighborhood, we have two kinds of people. We have young families because this is an affordable place to start in the real estate market. And you have empty nesters like us because it's an affordable place to retire in the real estate market. And so we just find that people are way more open to conversation. Children are a natural conversation starter. But people who would be in my generation, my age, they're the ones who are out and about in the evenings, and they're talking about all kinds of different things. How their children are doing, the fact that they're missing their grandkids. Grandparents like us, we have this common plight in that we're not able to hug our grandkids like we usually can. And it's deprivation for our older friends. But the younger people are just they're hungry for conversation, they're hungry for friendship. And any kind of conversation that I think distracts them from the demanding routine of being parent, teacher, disciplinary person, playmate, whatever. One of the things that we've taken the opportunity, I can't say we've taken the opportunity, but my wife, who's very creative, she actually hand painted some gift tags and put them on little hand sanitizer bottles and just distributed them around the neighborhood to just doors that she felt the Lord would have them drop them off. And she just signed Unit 63 on the bottom. Not from Unit 63, Unit 63. Well, a couple of them showed back up because I think they thought that they belonged to Unit 63. But when they came, we said, no, this is for you. And it just opened an opportunity for us to even have a conversation with them. And then she's collected river rocks out of the creek in our backyard and has painted them with little, blossoms and flowers and just left them randomly on people's front steps. And as we've walked through the neighborhood, people have recognized us, and they're just so grateful that there's this gesture of kindness. And I've just perceived that people are just more open to conversation. They're a little more transparent about what's going on in their lives. And there's just an opportunity to be able to speak into those realities as they share them willingly with us.
George, that was awesome. Thanks. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I appreciate this.
So as we mentioned earlier, Karen Wilk, Karen Reed, Mark Glanville are here as our panelists, and we're going to invite them into the conversation now. And really, you guys, we'd love to start with, what are you hearing? What are you hearing from what people have said about the text? What are you hearing from these stories? Let's start talking. Somebody kick us off. Mark, you want to dive in first?
Sure. Here in Vancouver, we had a Vancouver Foundation report that said one of the biggest problems in Vancouver was a feeling of social isolation and loneliness. And just coming into these stories as this movement, it feels like of a movement from isolation to community, or even a movement as well from homogeneity, where hockey families hang out with hockey families and parents hang out with other parents, homogeneity to a diversity of a neighborhood. And this movement from isolation to community is beautiful. And I wonder what the Lord's doing under this sun and under these trees and outside our houses.
One of the Karens, dive in.
Yeah, that's a sense that you heard that in a couple stories of how there's this sense of kindness level that has gone up. And with more space of time, people almost have kind of an attitude like they're on vacation, where they can kind of linger into conversation. And this seemed to hunger to have connection. And so it's just an intriguing thing where there's this desire, even in the distancing, to actually push in more to relationship and connection. So it's like I could sit on my porch all day and talk to people that go by. It's just like before this webinar, I was out putting a plant in the front, and like 3 neighbors, as soon as they see somebody out, they kind of migrate. There is a person that I can talk to. And so the sense of openness is intriguing to me.
Karen, Will?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I was unmuted.
Unmuted.
Now I am. And I think all of that kind of connects a little bit into, or this is what I'm wondering about, the Emmaus story, where, you know, kind of our expectations, the perspectives we've had in our frantic, busy, go, go, go type lives, just like for the 2 disciples, has been disrupted. We're in this new liminal space. We don't know where we're going or what it's going to look like, but somehow in that context, we're noticing new things. And I wonder if, just like Jesus came alongside those 2, Jesus is coming alongside us via the stranger / neighbor, in such a way that we're being open to some different perspectives, opening up to see maybe God's story, the bigger story, rather than, you know, what we had hoped. I heard that a number of times in the chat about the passage as well. And so for me, it raises a couple of questions. You know, how do we listen like Jesus? And you know, what kinds of my own agendas, church agendas, do we need to let go of in order to embrace and pay attention even more to what God's doing in our neighborhoods?
I'll also just add on that too, is this invitation to make more space for conversation. You know, that as they were walking, they were, you know, 7 miles, you know, talking and discussing. There was this sadness, so there this level of vulnerability about large issues, but that there was a lot of space as a way to process, to talk and to discuss. And so that intrigues me to say, how do I shift to make more, to accommodate that in this time where my neighbors are leaning in to wanting to talk and discuss. I had a neighbor that I did a seed exchange for my neighborhood last week, and maybe 25 neighbors came by. Half of them had never done any gardening. So there's this real pushing in, you know, we know of baking bread and growing food. And, but half of them had never grown food. So there's this an interesting thing of wanting to kind of ground themselves and learning how to grow food. But one of them sent me an email afterwards, and she had said, I don't think I have felt such despair and hopelessness and helplessness and pointlessness in such a long time. So we've set up a little time for her to come one-on-one in a couple days. So it just is this, normally she's very lighthearted and always funny. So this very strong invitation to want to talk and process and discuss. And so feel this invitation to accommodate, make space for that.
The reflection on, we're taking more time for one another, that's opened up somehow in the COVID period, and wondering what that could look like post-COVID. And then there's also this other intermixing of people who don't usually intermix. So George spoke about this intergenerational intermixing. And I loved Karen Wilk's incredible story where this sports-oriented family start to really dignify and appreciate the work of delivery workers, the way that in the COVID period, greengrocers have become an essential service and really crucial for everyone. So the intermixing is fascinating. I myself had a dear friend who suffers from addictions on the street, knock on our door out of nowhere, and we ended up sitting on the footpath and just wasting an hour sitting under the tree outside our footpath. The time, more time, the intermixing, and what invitations are there for when our health officers say you can go back to life a bit more as usual. how can the liminality be held somehow?
And I wonder if there's another lesson that the Spirit is urging us to learn in this, that on the walk initially, Jesus let them tell everything. I get the feeling that he was a non-judgmental, empathetic listener, and just made space for them to talk. And so often the church goes to telling and answering and, I don't know, solving problems, wanting to get our agenda out, so to speak. So maybe that's another piece of this. How might the text and our current sheltering in place be an invitation for us as the church to learn to listen again?
Karen, what you just said, George, is echoing in the chat. Should we be asking more questions than offering insights in our conversations? Draw people out about to talk about keeping things. So just making, I think George's, how are we creating more opportunities and being with folks so that, again, we're not passing on our insights, but opening up conversation and listening. I mean, it's like Jesus on the road, right? Jesus just asked a question and opened it up, and they just talked, it looked like for miles probably, about what was going on. And that was Jesus, who had all this incredible wisdom to share, but a whole lot of that road was listening.
Mm-hmm.
And then waiting to be invited.
I'm curious because one thing I'm aware of is how much my strong default is often in other practices of wanting to inspire or educate, or so to lean into those practices of learning how to ask questions and just hold that space. And then I'm curious around, there's parts of it that are saying, will there be enough time for some real shifts into these practices, even as a neighborhood? I wonder, will there be a quick returning back? And is there something that we can do to think about that?
I want to chime in just for a quick second on the whole taking time, listening. George's comment about asking questions more than making statements, and I was just pondering that and thinking through, why don't I do that in a better way? And most of the time it's because I don't have time. I want to hurry up and I want to finish the conversation, rather than asking a question actually elongates it, right? Like you're drawing somebody out. So we really do need to work on asking better questions, and in order to do that, we've got to have the space to be able to have the time to do that. So I appreciated that. Karen Wilk, I think you pulled some of that out in your story for sure also. It kind of leads me, Sarah Jane, into maybe we can keep talking about what we've heard, but transition a little bit or add another layer onto it. What are the questions that we're hearing in the midst of this? Or what are the questions that we should be asking in light of what we're hearing? So let's push down a little deeper and see where we get with that. Also, just reminding others, join in, participate on the chat, ask questions, make comments. It's great. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. So let's go from what are we hearing to what are the questions we should be asking in the midst of this.
So, and as I'd like to just read one because Jonathan's already posed a question, which I think we need to hold, whether we engage it. I think we need to hold it and then allow the panelists to sort of share some questions as well that are rising to the surface. But Jonathan shares, where the world seems to be migrating to an online existence and many churches are looking to deliver their services in that medium, what would you encourage us to consider in gathering people and encouraging practices for community formation? So big question about that, like how are we attending to and practicing formation in our communities? So I just want to hold that. I don't want to lose that, Jonathan, but I think that's a question that's coming to the surface for him.
Mm-hmm. I remember reading Rick Warren's very famous book on church, and him saying, we've got to give space and create structures for volunteers in our churches, because the people who attend our church are always going to be busy. If we don't give them a ministry in our church, they're going to go and join a hockey team or going to join some other volunteer thing in our community. And the discussion around space and time just cracks it open a little bit, doesn't it? And it kind of invites us to think, well, how can we actually free up our people, not to be always gathering, but with a vision for just stopping and wasting time, but actually spending time really well in their front yard.
It's good.
I'll throw in a few other questions. What high hopes, if you will, or perspectives, agendas do we need to lay down in order to pay attention? You know, what, like the two, are we not getting? Might be another way of saying it. And then what I've heard over and over again is, how do we listen like Jesus?
Karen Wilk, what might be an example of an agenda we might like to lay down or be invited to lay down? What would be an example of what you're thinking there?
Well, I think for Cleopas and I would say his wife Mary, they had to lay down their understanding of what Jesus was all about, to let go of saving Israel through conquering Rome to kingdom perspective. I think for us, it's laying down some of our church agendas, that my main goal in talking to a neighbor is to get them to come to a service or to participate in my Bible study,
Right.
or present, you know, 4 spiritual laws, that kind of thing.
Right.
I wonder if some of those things that drive our desire in those leading those kind of conversations is that we feel more comfortable if we have a sense of certainty of where we're going, and the posture of totally uncertainty. I think Oswald Chambers talks about that we're certain of God, but it makes everything else uncertain. And for most people, that leads to despair, and instead of expectancy. So I wonder how much this internal posture and practice, that we are more comfortable with uncertainty. We're certain that this is God's mission that we're a part of, but how comfortable am I with uncertainty? And so even whether it's in a microcosm of a conversation that I don't have a sense of where this is going to go, or a lead in outcomes or direction, but also on a larger picture in our neighborhood or our church communities.
That's really interesting, Karen Reed. It feels really brave and bold to me. I mean, it almost feels like, is there an invitation here for us as pastors to not think, okay, we're going to gather our people as soon as we can and return to those goals and agendas that we had back in early March, and that we just return to that track, but somehow when we regather, we're actually encouraging people to really mine what we've journeyed through together in the last 3 months. And there's uncertainty there, right? Because we don't know what the results are. We don't even know what we're inviting people to. But we know that God's cracking something open in our community right now. Sounds kind of scary, but it sounds like it's an incredible invitation.
Yeah, and Mark, just building on that, I don't know if you remember from the call on Tuesday, there was a comment, I can't remember if it was in the chat or somebody said it out loud, but we need to be careful that we don't even pray this thing away too quickly so we can get back to gatherings, that we wouldn't miss what it is that God's teaching us in the midst of this. So.
And maybe the deeper question, the what else question is, what is the church really? And to invite ourselves as church leaders and our congregants to reflect on what have we been learning, that maybe the church isn't just about a worship service on a Sunday morning and our programs and activities in the institution, in the building, but what does it mean to be the people of God, really?
And how can we maintain the level of growing friendships with neighbors that might be developing during this time, and also then go back to a very busy lifestyle of maintaining a lot of programs and running on adrenaline and deadlines? I think one of the things I discovered coming, is that you can't be present with people and be hyper busy. So I wonder about that, of how, if we're, moving away from seeing neighbors as optional relationships and start to grow friendships, how are we gonna be able to hold all the things that we were doing before?
Moving away from neighbours as optional relationships. That's beautiful, Karen Reed.
Getting lots of questions that sort of dig into.
Wonderful ones. Yeah.
I think they also kind of dig into or get us moving towards sort of leadership practices. And give me a moment here to frame this, but we've got cries of Ruth is sharing, about this need for relational connecting and this need for more platforms for prayer, contemplative prayer space for creativity, like George's wife giving these simple acts of kindness. There's Rosemary sharing about our country, who's had massive tragic loss, and the largest mass shooting we've ever experienced in Canada has happened a short time ago, and just the losses that are going on with sickness and illness, whether they're COVID related or not, and the inability to grieve together. And we're also questions of how do we manage our resources? Where's our churches at? So all of these things are pointing us towards, there's stuff we got to be paying attention to as leaders in our congregations. And in some ways, there was a rule book and we kind of had a sense of how to go about doing this. And all that's been thrown out the window. And now we're figuring out, how do we help people grieve? What does it look like to walk alongside our people in the midst of huge tragedies and loss? What does it look like to manage and steward our resources and our buildings? What does it look like to discover Christian practices when we can't be together in bodily form? And so and these might seem like all different questions, and they are different questions, but they get to the question of, what are some of the leadership practices that we need to be paying attention to nurturing, and to perhaps stepping into right now, that help us be in this liminal space and be the kind of leaders who can walk alongside our people in the midst of all the transition and all the disruption that's going on around us. And I know the three of you have the answers to all that. So I would just invite you to just like let us all know. But Cam as well, like just there's a real question of, how do we step into this in a pastoral, loving, caring way, but also in a way where we remain open to the other, where we are willing to be on this road. I don't know whether we're on the road and we're still processing and grieving, or whether we're listening, or whether we're at the table, wherever we are on that road, how are we stepping into the kind of leadership practices that allow us to be with others and to be attentive to what the Spirit's doing amongst us in quite a disruptive space, a liminal space. And we can get practical here.
Yeah,
like
no,
what are, like, I think, and I'm hearing some of this from you folks, but I wonder if we can continue to respond to some of these questions and ask, what are some of these practices and what do they need to look like?
Well, I think we're modeling one of the leadership practices, and that is asking different questions. So it's fine to do some of those, whatever you want to call them, church-focused questions. How are we going to run an online service? How are we going to provide pastoral care for our people? But in this conversation, and also through the text, I hear us, and I hope we will continue to engage with our councils or our elders and deacons, whatever that might look like in your church structure. Different kinds of questions. What is God doing in our neighborhoods? What might the Spirit be wanting to teach us if we pay attention to sheltering in place? And what does it mean to be faithfully present for us and for our congregations?
Karen, you're saying, yeah. So Karen, you're saying there needs to be a focus and a process and taking action, if you like, of how do we gather people, whatever space we're in, and actually see these kinds of questions, create space to address and answer and listen to one another around these questions. This is a very active, this isn't a passive piece. This is a very active part of leadership, isn't it? How are we creating these environments and spaces where we're naming the space we're in, like we're naming that liminal space, and we're building up almost a vocabulary and a practice around how are we listening to God through this? What is God leading us into? What are the possibilities here? What do we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, so for an example, instead of your typical church agenda, what if the leadership at the beginning of every meeting started with, what are you noticing in your neighborhood? What's God up to? And that, I think that's just a small way of beginning to reimagine what it means for us to be God's people in the places we're sheltered in right now. I'm curious what, other practices. I have some other ideas, but Mark and Karen.
One of the things I wonder about is that being invited into in this space with COVID is simplicity. That there's certain levels of simplicity that on some levels that are available to us. Like, you just know any holiday plans or travel are kind of off, all the conferences. And so there's some things that have kind of really streamlined. On others that are doing online services, things have been ramped up. So, so the idea though of living out our lives, that for most places they're contained to, an hour outside every day. People are cooking more and baking bread. And so there's these kind of very ordinary ways of being that have been heightened and valued. And so I wonder how does, and more integrated too, our lives when we're living more rooted locally are more integrated. So often in my experience, that was not how I was able to live when I was pastoring and commuting to the church building. And it was very hard to hold those integrated, simplified ways of living. So the challenge in this time of when we're trying to have an imagination and listening to what's ahead, how do we hold on to something that's not going to be sustainable in a new form here, and and how can we have enough space in our minds and imaginations and posture to be open to another way of being, that we're not just trying to figure out what is the game plan in trying to keep what has been familiar, and can there be this vigorous confidence in God's goodness, who is working all for good, that we don't have to know, which I feel always more in control if I can understand and know. Can we hold the ambiguity with uncertainty, and lean into simplicity and integrated ways of living that's sustainable?
So I'd like to read David's comment and just feed that back into what you just said, Karen. There's been a shift during the lockdown in the UK from people in the church saying, when we get back to normal, to, I wonder what the new normal will look like. But we can't have an instant answer to that, which some would like. We need to watch and listen and be unafraid of a liminal place. There is room here for renewed emphasis on the faithfulness of God as greater than the uncertainty of life. But I wanted to connect, Karen Reed, what you said with what Karen Wilk said as well, is that there's an invitation for us as church leaders here, as followers of Jesus, to lay down our need to have the way forward and the path, and here's how things should line up after this, to lay that down, to figure out what it is to be in that liminal space. And it seems like, just drawing from what you said, Karen Reed, that a lifting up of honoring and paying attention to these ordinary rhythms of life, that there's something really important in the midst of that that gives us the clues to the kind of life we're being called to live into, because it's in the midst of this baking of bread and sharing of seeds and sitting on the front stoop with your neighbor and lingering in the driveway for connections that there's stuff bubbling up there, and Jesus, the Spirit, is creating these connections with us and others. And so there's something in that we don't want to lose, that we're being woken up to, almost our eyes are being open to. So there's something in that for us as leaders to ask, how do we cultivate that? Like, what are we doing in our daily practice and in the way that we invite and shape and form and gather with our people? How are we encouraging and continuing to name that and grow that?
Sarah Jane, I'm going to jump in just for a quick sec, and I'm going to drill down, take what you've just said and go just drive it down to really, really practical stuff. There are so many good conversations happening in the chat that I feel like we're falling way behind some of that. But Mark, can I point this one at you? Sorry, bud. I'm gonna point this one at you for a second. You're about to go and become the practical theology instructor at Regent, and so I'm going to point this one at you. As I teach across the country, I'm asking the question of what percentage of our people in our churches understand that they are called, invited into the mission of God, or see themselves as sent ones versus consumers. And pastor after pastor after pastor is saying, yeah, we've just got lots of consumer Christians all over the place. I see some of that in the chat. Well, whose fault is that? That's our fault. We've created that. So now here we go in the midst of COVID and what we're seeing. Mark, what do we need to do? What are the practices that we can engage our people in that will go about helping us to pay attention to what we're supposed to learn in this, not just go back to the same old consumeristic practices we had before? What are the practices you're teaching at Grandview Calvary? What are you going to teach your class? What do we need to help our people to live into?
Really interesting. I was fascinated by the conversation. I mean, we've got to model it as leaders, right? Yeah, and what you said, Cam, is getting to the heart of Christian identity. You know, Jesus said at the end of John's Gospel, as the Father sent me, I'm sending you. And when Jesus said, as the Father sent me, I am sending you, he's showing us that being on mission, following in the way of Christ, for the sake of the world, isn't just one of the many things that Christians do, but we're a sent people in our very identity, that being on mission is our very identity as Christ followers. And to me, as leaders, we have to do three things. We have to preach for it. That missional identity has to come into every sermon, in my opinion. We have to model it. Second, we have to model it. And third, we have to pray for it. So that people, when they think of us, our lives, they know that we're living into Christ's way and that they can observe that as households, as individuals, as leaders. But then third, that we're praying for it and we're providing opportunity for other people to pray that the Holy Spirit would transform our congregation. In one church I pastored at 6 a.m. every Thursday, I used to invite the whole church to come to my house, which was the manse, for a prayer for revival, that the Holy Spirit will fall upon our church and convict us and give us imagination for our missional identity. So modeling, praying, preaching, somehow we have to do that with imagination right now, right? I think that I agree with what the two Karens have said, that somehow when we regather, we can't rush to go to an old normal. We have to regather tentatively, and we have to keep some things suspended. So, I mean, I think with everyone else, I'm just imagining right now, what might it mean for us to invite very explicitly our congregation not to go back to maxed out participation. I mean, all of our lives, early March, we were maxed out, right? Probably every single person on this call just about was maxed out. We barely had an hour to spare in our week. And so how, as we regather as Christian leaders in this hopefully once in a lifetime moment, can we encourage people not to rush back to the gathering, to filling every crack in our lives, but to keep cracks open for neighborhood? And I mean, one thing I've shared with you before, Cam, is I think, to me, the COVID period is foregrounding healing. Healing is it seems, a core value right now in society, the value of healers and those who can offer us healing. And I wonder, I mean, I think that as we deeply enter into community at God's invitation right now, that's a posture of healing. I just wonder what are the fresh imaginative nodes for our churches right now? And maybe healing is one of them. What would it mean just to be the healing presence of Christ?
So, Mark, Cam, can I take us into the chat as I kind of connect those ideas?
Please.
So I think I want to connect, Mark, your comment about healing and what does it look like to be the kind of people on mission that we're called to be. I want to drill down and just do a really practical story that just keeps coming up. And it came up on our missional commons a little bit. And there's a bit of a conversation in the chat. So I just want to read that to you all. And it's about this 7 o'clock ritual that we're now many of us are all participating in. So Jonathan starts, are any of the panelists struck by the 7 p.m. liturgy and our neighborly call to gather, celebrate, and bless our neighborhoods? Love the language there. It's fantastic. And then Alan responds, this is an example of the re-sacralization of the ordinary. Again, back to Karen's idea, like it's in these ordinary things, this space that we have, this blessing of the ordinary. People are hungering for rituals. It's almost as if God has left the building and is pressing us to join the Spirit in the neighborhood. And then I thought there was one more comment here too. But there's something about what's going on at 7 o'clock. Like, let's get under the surface, talk about a story about what's going on right now in our neighborhoods. I know, Fiona, you talk about it in your neighborhood too. You're seeing it all the time. What's going on underneath the surface there? What can we be doing instead of dreaming up new things to do? What's already going on, and how do we bless and step into this ordinary ritual that's already happening amongst us?
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you a story of what happened this last week. So there is, I don't know, scattering of our neighbors that faithfully, because we have porches, go out at 7 o'clock. And so you're able to make those connections. And there's 2 families 2 doors down from me that have kids. And they, and as far as I've known in maybe 4 years living across the street, had never developed any friendship or connection. But they're right across from the street every night. Their kids with 2 pan lids are playing the cymbals. And so they have this connection every night. And so then last week, I watched afterwards, we stayed out on the porch, and one of the little girls with her mother was bringing over a stuffed rabbit and bringing it to her new friend that they had been seeing each other every night. And so it's like there is this beginning of some kind of rhythm of connection that has awakened something that I fully can't even kind of name yet.
I mean, very practically, Karen Reed, can you imagine suspending home groups every second gathering in order to have socially distanced backyard barbecues, or some kind of, there must be some practical imagination that we can lead through.
The one thing the time with neighbors, just when life fills up, I've just observed it just slides off the table. And so how do we reorder our own lives first, before we're talking about how we're going to kind of lead church communities, our own lives and practices in a way that takes serious that to love God is to love neighbors. So that kind of bodied faith in our daily lives in the neighborhood, I'm curious about, what is being rooted in, or at least awakened in us, that that we can forge into practices that are sustained and not marginalized again.
Karen Reed, can I just layer onto that again? The differentiation in our societies of rich and poor, housed and not housed, and the way that COVID has cracked that open. People have been speaking about interconnectedness. Common identity was mentioned earlier on, about an hour ago. Essential services being greengrocers and deliveries. I'm just aware in Vancouver of the common suffering of many people who are on or near the street. I wonder if as we free up our schedules, as we suspend certain things in our churches and take leadership there, so we can open up people's time to be 7 p.m. sacralized ritual people, how can we lean deeply and tilt towards the margins as Jesus did, and not just make space for people like us?
Yeah, I think it's that whole place that it's everyone in your neighborhood. So it's just not, again, if your orientation is for the neighborhood, it's inclusive of everyone in the neighborhood, just not. So if you're this shift from entertaining friends and family, people like you,
Right.
hospitality would include everyone in the circle.
Right. Yeah.
There's also the whole piece of being the guest or the host in the midst of all that too, and where are the places we're being invited. And so I remember the first week COVID happened, and I was just go and getting things done, and didn't realize I was an emotional wreck underneath it all. And I sat down on my front porch, and this woman came out from behind the house who I'd never seen before, didn't even know she lived there, and she came up with a drum. And she was an Indigenous woman, and she started drumming with her baby, and her baby was dancing around her. And I was just bawling, because I'm like, okay, I haven't dealt with my emotions yet. And what's the gift that she had to give that I didn't even know about? Like, so who are the people that are blessing us in the midst of this? Where are the places where we're receiving from others? Where, like, who are the generous neighbors that are like feeding all the people in the retirement home just around the corner? And how are we paying attention to that? It's like, so when we're making space for others, it's not just to be in that space of how do I serve and how do I bring this into a church mentality where we organize around it, but how are we actually learning to pay attention to and receive in trust that God is at work, and God is renewing, and God is restoring, and God is renewing our hope as well. And that in this liminal space, it's such a gift to be able to hold those things and to receive those gifts and to be cared for by others and to participate in this ritual that we had nothing to do with starting. What is this liturgy at 7 o'clock that we're not in charge of, yet we participate in? And so there's this lovely, subtle, yet powerful shift I feel is going on, where we are experiencing this very strange mix up of roles, and we're invited to be guests in so many ways to our neighbors, whether it's the invitation to chat under the tree for you, Mark, or all those places where we get to be received by another. And I think there's so much richness for us to learn there as followers of Christ.
It's hard in that I find one of the greatest hindrances is when I put on my professional hat. And we translate all this and think about all this as professional clergy. I've been intrigued in this last number of years of reflecting that neighbor and homemaker are the two roles that have never been professionalized. And so it's not moving into the temptation to translate all this into our professional role as clergy, but as a neighbor, and thinking about how are we living as neighbors in a neighborhood, in a place rooted in.
Sarah Jane, I'm astounded by the number of comments in the chat box today. They've just been so rich, and I think, if I might comment, there's no chance we're going to capture them all during this. So we're going to post many of them, take them, put them in the Missional Commons Facebook page, interact with them a little bit more there. So even though the conversation, I think, I look at the clock and we're starting to move towards, sort of the last couple of minutes here. But the conversation can continue. It can continue on Facebook. It can continue in a couple of weeks, and we'll get to that in a minute. Do you mind? Can I ask sort of one last question and give our panelists maybe freedom to answer this? I know we've been dancing around it, but if you had to sort of draw things together and say, what must we be careful not to miss in this time? Let's not wish it away. Let's not wish to get back. But in the midst of this, what would you have us pay attention to the most? I know there was some really good conversation that came out on Tuesday. Let's see if there's some of those same things that come up, or maybe you've had some more chance to think. So why don't each of you take a turn and just say, I really think we should be careful not to miss these things. Who wants to go first?
I think one of the things we're learning that we don't want to miss or leave behind is that when God goes on mission, he goes in person and place, that it's incarnational, that it's flesh and blood moving into the neighborhood. And as Sarah Jane was saying, when we are rooted there and paying attention, it's not just what we're doing to serve someone else or to do for, it's the being with that Jesus was with. So how can we live into and recognize, I think Craig Van Calder says that the church is the personal presence of Christ in the world through the Spirit. And somehow we may have lost that in our commuter, consumeristic, busy, etc. type expressions of church. So let's not lose the significance of being present, incarnational, like Jesus in our places.
I would offer that we would not give in to the temptation to become functional atheists in the journey. That this is God's deal. He's not in crisis. This hasn't caught him by surprise. He's the one that is working everything for good, that his kingdom would come on earth as it is in heaven. And so that we would give attention to our own confidence in God's goodness and his claim on our life, and that would be enough, that we wouldn't insist on anything more to trust him for all the uncertainty that lies ahead. That where he's placed us, that he has a purpose for us to join in that work, and that we would vigorously trust like we've never before, with holding uncertainty out of this deep certainty of who God is and his goodness.
It's beautiful. Thanks, Karen.
I've been really struck by just the invitation to shift or reconsider church goals, and not just to re-enter the stream that we left early March. Reconnecting with the Road to Emmaus story, as a key thread there seems to be the humility of Christ. The disciples just could not understand how crucifixion had a part in a story where we thought he was going to be the one who was to redeem Israel. And Jesus checked them and he said, was it not necessary for the Messiah first to suffer and then to enter his glory? And Jesus, with that statement, he brings together humiliation and glorification, crucifixion and salvation, in a way that the disciples just could not fathom. That somehow when we bring together suffering and salvation, that life is birthed. And somehow when we bring together humiliation and glorification in our understanding of the biblical story, that God wins. And I just wonder then, coming from the Road to Emmaus story, whether or not that's an invitation for us to embrace humility at this time, not to see ourselves as a central institution of our cities, because we're not. Apparently the greengrocers are, the delivery trucks and the doctors and the nurses. To embrace our humility and to reimagine, as has been shared, what it might mean to slow down and submit to those wonderful 7 p.m. rhythms and find Christ there.
Mark, this is fantastic. And I want to thank you three for, we all want to thank you three for participating today and encouraging the conversation. One of the things that I'm taking away today, I know that in the last couple of years, for me, there's been a conversion process going on that goes away from deep stuff that's in me that says I take Jesus somewhere, to the conversion to realizing that in the midst of dwelling in a place, I actually meet Jesus in my non-Christian neighbors and he teaches me through them. And that's been part of the conversion. I think one of the things I heard you three say today, came out in the chat as well, why am I not inviting my neighbors into a set of practices, or why are we as a neighborhood not discovering a set of practices where we together, Christians and non-Christians, engage in discovering where Jesus is at work? And so that's been a huge takeaway for me today. So thank you for your participation and help with that. Sarah Jane, can I give it back to you to sort of bring home?
Yeah, I want to just follow with one of the things that Candler said, is that we're going to continue the conversation. There was a lot of rich stuff going on in the chat that we didn't get a chance to bring in.
And we actually do pay attention to that. And some of it might not be just posting. We might actually want to get in touch and say, hey, folks, do we want to have a conversation about this? So do know that we are paying attention to the things that have gone on there, and we are going to be listening to that and to you. In fact, we're going to be together again in about 2 weeks, so pay attention to that. The week of May 12th, another month already. Just when we thought we didn't realize it was April, now it's going to be May again. So May 12th, we're going to be together again, and just look for more information about that. And then as well, I just wanted to share with you, there is a Facebook group, and it's basically a space for us to continue to connect around stories, ideas, and dwelling, and just discerning together what's going on here, and how do we keep the kinds of questions, and how do we keep the kind of space that's been this webinar open to each other in this strange time. So the link for that is down there, and we just invite you to join that. So with that in mind, we are going to do our very best to give everyone a little breather in case you're on to another call or another piece after that. I'm going to invite Fiona to give us a blessing, and then end our webinar.
So I just want to add my thanks to everybody who participated today, both in the chat and also in person. Thank you to Mark and to Karen Reed and to Karen Wilk for sharing your reflections with all of us today. So I'll just leave you with these words. As we discover our part in God's mission in our own locations, may we continue to listen with the expectation that God is present, always ahead, always beside, always guiding, everlasting. Amen.
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 Thanks again, Mark, Karen Reed, and
Yeah.
Karen Wilk. Really good to have
And
you.
everybody who attended. It was
Mhm.
great.
Thanks all.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for engaging in the chat, really digging in. That was wonderful.
Fantastic.